Tom Abbate, attorney at law, and today I'm going to talk to you about deadlines for 2254 federal writs of habeas corpus. Now, just a brief explanation as to what a federal writ of habeas corpus is. In state courts, you have a right to petition the court to have the state justify your conviction and or sentence through a vehicle known as a writ of habeas corpus. If you are unsuccessful in that endeavor in a state court, you may then go to the federal courts and have them review whether or not your conviction and or sentence is justified. Now, there are two things that you got to keep in mind. One, at least in Texas, there is no deadline on a state writ, but you have to file it first before you can go to a federal writ. This is because there is an exhaustion requirement, and you have to have exhausted your claims in the highest state court before you have the permission to go to the federal court and address those things there. So you have an unlimited amount of time in Texas to do this. However, you do have a 1-year deadline from the point at which your conviction becomes final in order to apply in federal court. This 1-year deadline found in ADIPA will be told by the filing of a state writ, at least during the pendency of that state writ. That won't count towards that 1 year. However, this can take some time to get a state writ ready to go, to find an attorney that's competent to handle it. So you really need to be thinking about these things really during the time that you're doing your appeals, because the way you determine when your conviction became final is going to be based on your appellate timetables. It is going to be whenever the last action occurred or when the deadline to seek direct review of that last action expires. So, for instance, in Texas, the highest criminal court is the Court of Criminal Appeals. After you have an appellate opinion come back that does not grant you relief, you have 30 days to apply to the Court of Criminal Appeals to have your case heard. If the Court of Criminal Appeals, either rejects or hears it, you then have 90 days from the date of whatever their decision was to apply for a writ of certiorari with the United States Supreme Court. So, assuming that you filed a petition for discretionary review, which was refused, which is the large majority of petitions for discretionary review, from the date of the refusal, you have 90 days to apply to the United States Supreme Court. Once that 91st day occurs, that is when that 1-year timeline is going to start to run. So, in that year, you have to hire an attorney, have that attorney investigate your writ, and have them prepare it and file it. This can take an extensive amount of time depending on what the issues are. So it's very important that you rush to get an attorney if you think you need a writ of habeas corpus in the state of Texas. Once it's filed with the Texas courts, from that day until the Texas courts rule on it, will not count towards that 1-year deadline. But depending on the level of your case, you may have used 8-9 months. It's often common for us to have as little as 2 weeks left in order to get a 2254 filed once a 1107 or whatever state writ you filed is overturned. So it's very important that you be thinking about this while you're thinking about state writs. The federal writ, has to be based on federal law. So not all of the claims will go through, but it's important that whenever you're contemplating hiring a state attorney to handle a state writ, that you also think about the federal writ. Is that attorney admitted to the federal bar, and can they file a federal writ for you? Do they have any experience in filing federal writs? And do you believe that they can get the state writ done with enough time for you to file the federal writ? Sometimes you need to go all the way to that federal writ because the Texas court isn't really answering the question. They're just issuing their infamous denied without written order and moving on. And so in order to get a real hearing, you may have to go to the federal courts. And so it's important that if you're in the appellate process now, you start thinking about what's going to happen if your appeal gets denied. Because you're only going to have that 1 year timeline from whenever your conviction became final, and you're going to have to go through a whole separate vehicle. So these are things that you really need to keep in mind when picking a writ attorney.